Lucasfilm is claiming that Dave Filoni is George Lucas's apprentice. However, George Lucas made it very clear he was not mentoring anyone to take over Star Wars back in the early 2000s. Let's get into this here. Lucasfilm and Star Wars recently released a featurette highlighting their latest Disney Plus series, Ahsoka, in which Jon Favreau makes the claim that Dave Filoni is George Lucas's apprentice. In the clip from Master and Apprentice, a special look at Ahsoka, Favreau recalls that George Lucas made a set visit to The Mandalorian, saying, George visited the set when we were filming the lightsaber fight in the Japanese garden in Season 2. And I think he was really encouraging of Dave stepping up to this role. And so George would turn to Kathy and myself and be proud of Dave. He was Dave's teacher, and Dave was his apprentice. They included a number of still shots here. I guess it was a little bit of some videos that they took of it. But interestingly enough, Lucas makes absolutely no comments in the little special here. But instead, it's Favreau speaking for George Lucas. The reason for that is because Lucas probably would never describe Filoni as his apprentice. Back in the early 2000s, while discussing The Revenge of the Sith with CNN, Lucas made it abundantly clear there was no one going to take over from him when it came to theatrical releases. When asked if he wanted Star Wars to continue after his life, Lucas responded, no. I've worked it out to where when I do it in terms of the films that I'm doing, this will be the last. The next film, 3, will be the last film, and it'll be a 6-part series, and that'll be the end of it. He was then asked if he was mentoring someone to take over for him. He replied, no, there may be other venues for it, but not in the theatrical release, but for sort of offshoot stories and things in other areas, but not in theatrical films. I just want to keep that special. I don't want to have it sort of turn into Star Trek. Hilariously enough, that is exactly what the Walt Disney Company has kind of done. They've taken Star Wars out of the theatricals and now have turned it into a television program. Obviously, Lucas would release the animated Star Wars The Clone Wars film by Dave Filoni to theaters in 2008. He told Entertainment Weekly at the time that the film was actually originally supposed to be the animated series. He says, the Clone Wars movie was almost an afterthought. We were doing the TV series and looked at some of the episodes on the big screen and said, this is so beautiful. Why don't we just go and use the crew and make a feature? So we did. However, he also made clear he had no intention of returning to feature films, telling EW, no more. I mean, except for this kind of stuff, which is sort of spin-offs or TV shows. So he's kind of making an exception for the Clone Wars animated film. Obviously, Lucas's intentions would change again when he sold Lucasfilm to the Walt Disney Company back in 2012, when it was announced the company would be making 3 more feature films. Lucas said at the time, we've got a plan for 7, 8, and 9, which is the end of the trilogy, and other films also. So we have a large group of ideas and characters and books and all kinds of things. We could go on making Star Wars for the next 100 years. However, Lucas would be quickly sidelined, and his plans for the next trilogy would be purchased by the Walt Disney Company and never see the light of day. You have the Walt Disney Company CEO Bob Iger admitting this in his book, The Ride of a Lifetime, Lessons Learned from 15 Years Ago. As CEO of the Walt Disney Company, that's the title of the book. I mean, it's a really long title. But he said in the book, at some point in the process, George told me that he had completed outlines for 3 new movies. He agreed to send us 3 copies of the outlines, one for me, one for Alan Braverman, and one for Alan Horn, who'd just been hired to run our studio. Alan Horn and I read George's outlines and decided we needed to buy them, though he made clear in the purchase agreement that we would not be contractually obligated to adhere to the plot lines he laid out. He would then reveal the future of Star Wars would not be beholden to George Lucas. He said he knew that I was going to stand firm on the question of creative control, but it wasn't an easy thing for him to accept. And so he reluctantly agreed to be available to consult with us at our request. I promised that we would be open to his ideas. This was not a hard promise to make. Of course, we would be open to George Lucas's ideas, but like the outlines, we would be under no obligation. From there, Iger explained how they had their own vision for Star Wars and how Lucas felt betrayed. He said, the truth was Kathy, J.J. Abrams, Alan, and I had discussed the direction in which the saga should go, and we all agreed that it wasn't what George had outlined. George knew we weren't contractually bound to anything, but he thought that our buying the story treatments was a tacit promise that we'd follow them, and he was disappointed that his story was being discarded. He added, I'd been so careful since our first conversation not to mislead him in any way, and I didn't think I had now, but I could have handled it better. I should have prepared him for the meeting with JJ and Michael and told him about our conversations, that we felt it was better to go in another direction. I could have talked through this with him and possibly avoided angering him by not surprising him. Iger then revealed now in the first meeting with him about the future of Star Wars, George felt betrayed, and while this whole process would never have been easy for him, we'd gotten off to an unnecessarily rocky start. Lucas would eventually share his thoughts on Disney rejecting his story ideas. Speaking with Vanity Fair in 2015, he said the issue was ultimately they looked at the stories and they said, we want to make something for the fans. People don't actually realize it's actually a soap opera and it's all about family problems. It's not about spaceships. So they decided they didn't want to use those stories. They decided they were going to do their own thing. So I decided, fine. He would then do a sit-down interview with Charlie Rose where he described the Walt Disney Company as white slavers. He said, I sold them to the white slavers that takes these things. And then he kind of realized what he was saying and he kind of stopped talking there. Infamous line there from George Lucas. He would also discuss the outlines he sold to Disney for the sequel trilogy in that Charlie Rose interview. He said they looked at the stories and they said, we want to make something for the fans. They decided they didn't want to use those stories. They decided they were going to do their own thing. They weren't that keen to have me involved anyway, but if I get in there, I'm just going to cause trouble because they're not going to do what I want them to do, and I didn't have the control to do that anymore, and all I would do is muck everything up. And so I said, okay, I will go my way, and I'll let them go their way. And then more recently, I think this was about like last year, 2 years ago, he made it clear he was not involved in the direction that Star Wars was taking. He says, I don't know. I mean, I've kind of lost control of Star Wars, so it's going off in a different path than what I intended. So, no, Dave Filoni is not the apprentice of George Lucas. Lucas made that abundantly clear in that interview with CNN that he was not mentoring anyone. And then he's also made it very clear that the Star Wars franchise is going off on a different path than what he intended. So, Jon Favreau claiming that Dave is somehow George Lucas's apprentice is just simply not true and is just Star Wars and Lucasfilm spin and PR trying to elevate Dave Filoni to a position that he doesn't actually deserve.
Subscribe for more.